Let's see what she's got. Ooh. Okay. Let's see her charge attack. Wait! Hey everyone, it's Sevy and welcome to a Lauma pre-release video. I know, I'm excited too. I was given access to the CE server for this version. As CE server, it's not the final product, just a quick disclaimer. There are still some things that may be subject to change, but I thought that I'd give you guys a first look at Lauma, show you what she does, how she works, plus some showcases and first impressions. So at this point, I've played her for about 6 to 7 hours doing some testing, also recorded my runs doing it. And this video, just so you know, it's not going to be a guide. I'm not going to include any prescriptive recommendations such as build stats, weapons, or choosing between her weapon and C1 or anything like that. I really just want to give you a preview of her. It's been a while since I've done this, okay? I'm a little bit rusty, just saying. And without further ado, let's begin. All right, we're going to start off with some of the visuals with how gorgeous she is. By the way, guys, I also have a redemption code. I'll leave it in the description and pinned comment. Make sure to redeem it for 60 extra primos, and let's go back to the video. So these are Lauma's normal attacks. 1, 2, 3. Oh my god, she's so graceful. 1, 2, 3. And then here's what happens if you charge attack with her. Yeah. She turns into a deer. It's so cool. I mean, you probably already saw this in the special program, and it's super pretty also. Okay, so here's her hold skill. Consume the verdant dew. And this is her first. Ooh. So we see that that deer that deer loping around, and that's the periodic dendro damage that her skill deals. Now let's move on to her kit. And before we get into her kit, I kind of want to talk about some preliminary info regarding general mechanics that's going to affect how we understand her kit. So the first thing is the team's Moonsign. Now the Moonsign of the team is dependent on how many Nodcry characters are in the team. If you have one Nodcry character, then you're going to have the nascent Moonsign. But if you have 2 or more Nodcry characters in the team, then you're going to have the ascendant Moonsign. So if you only have Lauma on the team, then you're going to have a nascent Moonsign. If you're going to have Lauma and Aino on the team, you're going to have an ascendant Moonsign. And that's important because it appears in mechanics of weapons, artifacts, and even passive talents of characters. The other thing that's important to know is about the Lunar Bloom reaction. So the Lunar Bloom reaction, they mentioned this in the live stream in the special program if you saw it. Basically, Lunar Bloom reaction happens under certain conditions, meaning this is something that will have to be specified within character kit mechanics. If you proc the Lunar Bloom reaction, it's going to give you a verdant dew stack, and that's going to be seen in these crescent moon icons down at the side below the character and also beside the character, and those verdant dew stacks will be used for different mechanics, as you'll see later on with Lauma. So how Lauma works is that she's basically Shenhe / Yunjin, but for Bloom and Lunar Bloom and Bloom Plus reactions. If you're familiar with Shenhe's and Yunjin's kits, basically they add base damage to other attacks in the party. For Shenhe, she adds base damage to cryo attacks. For Yunjin, she adds base damage to normal attacks. For Lauma, she adds base damage to Bloom, Hyperbloom, Burgeon, and Lunar Bloom, essentially. And that additive base damage that she gives, it scales mainly on her EM stat. She has a few passives here and there that also increase that Bloom Plus and Lunar Bloom damage in other ways, but that's her core mechanic. Now that core mechanic comes through the Pale Hymn stack, and the Pale Hymn stack, it comes from her burst. So basically when she casts her burst, she acquires a bunch of Pale Hymn stacks, and then those Pale Hymn stacks are consumed every time a Bloom or a Bloom Plus or Lunar Bloom reaction deals damage to an opponent, and multiple damage instances consume multiple Pale Hymn stacks and all that. If you're familiar with Shenhe Yunjin kit, again, it's going to perform in a similar manner. The burst, it additionally, aside from giving those Pale Hymn stacks, it also can add onto Pale Hymn stacks through her skill mechanic. So when you tap her skill, it just deals dendro damage, but when you hold her skill, it deals dendro damage, it deals Lunar Bloom damage, and it consumes any verdant dew stacks that she acquires from proccing Lunar Bloom reactions, she turns those Verdant Dew stacks into Moonsong stacks. I know. Stacks into stacks and then turn into other stacks. It's like, okay, classic Genshin. Anyway, she acquires Moonsong stacks from holding her skill, and then her burst turns those Moonsong stacks into extra Pale Hymn stacks for extra base damage instances, essentially. If we're gonna razor language this process, it's like you accumulate Verdant Dew stacks, you hold her skill to turn those Verdant Dew into Moonsong stacks, and then you cast her burst to turn those Moonsong stacks into additional Pale Hymn stacks. Hopefully that helps. As you can imagine, her gameplay or her rotation would be something like proc her Lunar Bloom reactions and then hold her skill to consume those and turn them into Moonsong, and then cast her burst to turn Moonsong into Pale Hymn. And then that's how you get maximum Pale Hymn stacks in order to do the additive base damage as much as possible. There is some flexibility to that rotation because her burst has this additional description that says if you convert Moonsong stacks into Pale Hymn stacks, or if Lauma is holding Moonsong stacks within 15 seconds after casting her burst, then those get added into Pale Hymn stacks anyway. So it doesn't always have to be hold skill and then burst. You can do burst and then hold skill within the next 15 seconds. I appreciate that note of flexibility in terms of rotation. I assume that's how it works because that seems to be the intention of that added clause, but correct me if I'm wrong. Aside from that, her skill follows her around and deals AoE dendro damage every 2 seconds. So that's obviously very good for Bloom, where you want AoE damage to hit multiple opponents at a time, and she periodically deals that. Also, it reduces enemies' dendro and hydro resistance, and that scales with her skill level. So at skill level 10, it can reduce up to 25% dendro resistance and hydro resistance of enemies, so that's amazing. Moving on to her passives. So she has a passive that's pretty straightforward. It increases Lauma's skill damage and decreases her charged attack transformation cooldown based on her EM stat. So the higher her EM, the more skill damage she gets, and the lower her charged attack transformation cooldown. But there are two confusing passives, or there are two passives that I do feel the need to clarify. Let's go through those step by step. So first is this passive that lets either Bloom reactions crit, or it increases the crit rate and crit damage of Lunar Bloom reactions based on the Moonsign of the team. If you only have the nascent Moonsign, which is one Krai character, then she's going to let Bloom reactions crit. And this does in fact stack with other abilities that allow Bloom reactions to crit, such as Nahida's C2. Now, if you have the Ascendant Moonsign, which again is 2 or more Krai characters on the team, then she's going to increase the crit rate and crit damage of Lunar Bloom reactions. Also, it clearly states in this passive that the two effects cannot stack. So moving on to her next passive, and this is the thing that might have some confusion. This passive converts Bloom reactions into Lunar Bloom reactions.
Okay, doesn't that mean with the previous passive that everything is going to be Lunar Blooms, and then that also lets it crit rate and crit damage more because then it ends up stacking?
So here's the thing. Lunar Bloom reactions don't necessarily mean they deal Lunar Bloom damage. We're going to have to separate Lunar Bloom into the reactions and the damage. So Lunar Bloom as a reaction, it's basically like a normal bloom, but it gives Verdant Dew stacks. And you can tell because when it explodes, it still looks like a normal bloom damage number. But Lunar Bloom damage, that's going to be specified. And when it deals damage, it's going to have the italicized Lunar Bloom damage look. Lauma has some instances of Lunar Bloom damage. It says in her skill description that when she casts her hold skill, she has an instance that's considered Lunar Bloom damage. However, when it says that she converts Bloom reactions into Lunar Bloom reactions, all it's saying is that anytime a Bloom reaction is triggered, you also get Verdant Dew stacks. That's all it's saying. These blooms aren't magically going to be dealing Lunar Bloom damage. So in the Nascent team, her passive lets Bloom reactions crit, and in the Ascendant team, because the passives can't stack, she only gets the passive that increases the crit rate and crit damage of the Lunar Bloom damage. In that passive, it also increases Lunar Bloom base damage based on her EM stat. But that's only really going to be relevant in teams that deal a lot of Lunar Bloom damage. We'd probably be waiting for more characters that deal Lunar Bloom damage in their kit. So that's the rundown of Lauma's talents. Honestly, if you don't want to worry about all that, the only things you really need to know is that she's like Shenhe, but for Bloom reactions. And at this point, there are some notes I'd like to add here, which are some good to know summary binary things, such as her passives just give a bit of a party limitation, wherein if you want your blooms to crit, she has to be the only not Krai character on the team. Because if you have more than one not Krai character on the team, she's no longer going to be allowing those bloom plus reactions to crit. She basically has a very EM-centric build because all the parts of her kit that are important, they scale on her EM stat. Additionally, she needs enough ER to burst reliably. ER ranges can vary depending on your combat scenario, but it's very important that she can burst reliably because that's how she gives you your Pale Him stacks, aka your additional damage to bloom plus reactions. And then again, her skill and burst are going to be the most important to use and to level up. The skill, I would mainly level it up for the Dendro and Hydro Resistance Shred, and then for the burst, you want to level that up for, of course, the scaling of the Pale Him stacks. Since she is a Catalyst user, if you need an on-fielder to apply Dendro to enemies just so that you get more blooms here and there, she can be the Dendro driver on field. If you have enemies though that hit quite heavy, you just want to be careful because as a Catalyst user, she can be staggered a bit more easily than certain other weapon types, so just keep that in mind. But of course, if you don't want to play her on field, she at least has her skill which periodically deals Dendro damage from off field. Alright, it's time for her showcase. Now for her showcase, I'm going to be using her signature weapon, and then she's going to be using Silken Moon Serenade, which is the new artifact set that basically increases the EM of the entire party. And then she has around 200+% ER because I'm going to be using her in a boss fight. And this is her at C0 with talent at level 9. Later on, I'm going to be showing a round where she's using a 4-star weapon. Alright, so some things I noticed from doing these runs is that because this was Stygian Onslaught 5, and yeah, these teams can actually clear Stygian Onslaught 5, and these are all C0 5 stars. They do have their signature weapons. If you look at the artifact, the stats aren't even that great. These are just artifacts that are like generated automatically by the CE server. Between the runs, because this is a boss fight wherein the boss has some invulnerability phases, what basically mattered was getting the boss down with only 2 invulnerability phases. Because if you went past that, then you'd basically go overtime. Of course, if you went under that, if you could like get it down within just 1 phase, then your time would be very fast. All this to say, the difference between Lauma and having Nahida on the team versus Lauma and Yao Yao was very little, because all that mattered was you dealt enough damage between its invulnerability phases to get it down. And the Yao Yao team was actually able to deliver that. I also tried a Lauma-less Nilou Bloom team run, and it was able to clear Stygian 5, but just barely. Like, the difference between having Lauma there and not having Lauma there is pretty massive. The Lauma Kuki Hyperbloom team, it did perform significantly slower than the Nilou Bloom team, but honestly, that's kind of expected, in my opinion, because Nilou Bloom teams are just very powerful, and what more if they're like supercharged with Lauma and those bountiful cores are allowed to crit, right? So that's just a whole lot of damage versus a Lauma Kuki team. I took these clips before they announced the whole thing about the level 100 cap, so I don't know what this is going to look like with a level 100 Kuki, wherein her Hyperbloom scaling is going to be presumably higher. Just throwing that out there, maybe that's something that we can test if anyone gets a level 100 Kuki. I tested this versus a non-Lauma Hyperbloom team. The difference was pretty massive. The non-Lauma Hyperbloom team, probably because this is a boss fight as well, so the Dendro core damage generation and the Dendro core damage, since it is limited to 2 instances per like, what, 0.5 seconds, it was just quite slow. Aside from that, I just wanted to try out Lauma on a Nilou team with Aino to see if her base damage addition alone would be enough to like clear the Stygian Onslaught stage with the Nilou team. Because remember, if you put Aino on the team, then Nilou's bountiful cores are no longer going to crit. But Lauma still does give that additional base damage. And honestly, it was able to clear quite fine. So if you really want to play Aino, even if your blooms aren't going to crit, then it's still viable for this Stygian Onslaught 5. Like, it's still going to be enough. I also had no problem clearing Spiral Abyss 12 all the way with Lauma, but that's kind of to be expected because usually the Abyss cycles or the blessing it usually matches up to the character that's on the banner at the time. So you just need to take these showcases with a grain of salt, because usually the cycles that they run for the end game, they are made to feel easier if you do have like the banner character at the time. These are just the content that I wanted to showcase Lauma doing, or showcase Lauma with, just so you can see how she performs in combat. the last bit of this video, I'll just give you a quick rundown of her constellation. So C1 gives her some healing abilities, which is of course going to help if you are using a Nilou team, because you definitely want to heal her on the team so that you don't die yourself. It at least gives her that consolidation. So your fourth slot doesn't have to be spent on a healer. You don't need Kokomi, or you don't need Yaya or Baiju essentially. And that frees you up for more powerful units. C2, it mega buffs her Pale Him scaling. And then for parties with 2 or more not Krai characters, or parties with, I guess, the Ascendant Moonsign, it gives a 40% increase to Lunar Bloom damage. So obviously buff to Lunar Bloom damage teams. C3, burst level +3. C4 is an energy constellation where she gets additional energy in certain circumstances, and then of course it has a cooldown. C5 is her skill level +3. C6, of course, as a C6, it makes her into a broken on-fielder character. C6 gives extra hits from her skill, and those will be considered Lunar Bloom damage. They're not going to consume Pale Him stacks, and in fact they're going to add Pale Him stacks. And then Lauma's normal attacks will use Pale Him stacks to give it higher scaling, and also those will be considered as Lunar Bloom damage. Also further buffs team members Lunar Bloom damage. So it basically just lets her supercharge Lunar Bloom teams. It's a typical C6 kind of thing where, okay, your character can now be played on field and she'll be broken no matter what. Now, my first impressions overall is that she's obviously a very strong character for those Bloom plus teams, whether that's Bloom, Hyperbloom, Burgeon, Nilou Bloom. The Lunar Bloom damage buff, we're kind of going to have to wait for more characters that can fit into Lunar Bloom damage teams, because right now, even with Lauma and Aino, when I was testing that team, there wasn't even a lot of Lunar Bloom damage going around. We're going to have to wait for other characters or other mechanics that actually have Lunar Bloom damage built into their kit more. She's introduced as an early non-Krai character because she does buff those Bloom plus teams that already exist, and the buff is quite significant. So honestly, like, if you're really invested in the Bloom meta or the Nilou Bloom meta and you want it to get even stronger, then Lauma would be a good pickup. But if it's not your thing, then I don't think you have to feel like you're missing out on anything, except maybe those huge personalities she carries around. Aside from that, her animations are actually pretty low-key. They're not as flashy as I thought they would be. I do like that when she deals damage with her skill, she has her deer prancing around. I think that's really pretty. Of course, her transforming into a deer for exploration, I think that's super cool. I think that's gorgeous. And then when they talked about how in the live stream, when you go around Krai with her, the animals, like, they have special interactions with her. I actually, in my opinion, that was like more pull worthy than like the combat stuff, because I feel like Nilou Bloom teams are already strong, but this is the first time they've released a character that has like unique interactions with like animals or people or, you know, things like that. I feel like that's actually really cool. But yeah, I hope that that gave you a better idea of how Lauma works, what she does, how she fits into certain teams. Again, this is not meant to be like a prescriptive full guide video, but hopefully it shed some light on her and maybe helped you with either anticipating pulling for her and how she would fit into your account, or at least giving you that early preview that I myself was also surprised to see. Let me know in the comments what you think of Lauma, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and I'm going to see you soon. Take care.